Over the past 2 days, we've heard lots about the latest IPCC report. Today, we're going to turn to adaptation, particularly in the global south. I'm David Pilling, Africa editor of the Financial Times. With me, I have Preeti Sina, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, Parag Khanna, founder and managing partner of FutureMap, Letitia Desmarais, Director of Climate Finance Access Network, and Vivek Pathak, Director and Global Head of Climate Business at the IFC. Parag, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You've called adaptation the neglected sibling of climate action. Can you make the case for the neglected sibling? Make the case for adaptation.
Certainly I can. Thank you so much, David. And it's a pleasure to join you and this distinguished panel. And of course, I'm grateful that you're putting such a spotlight on this topic, not only in light of the recent IPCC report that you just mentioned, but also because I genuinely believe we need to have a greater degree of balance in the conversations on mitigation and adaptation, both of which, of course, are very important. But depending on which source one looks at, anywhere from 90% up of total climate finance related investment is going into mitigation rather than adaptation, which can mean so many things. Let me first perhaps clarify definitionally. It can be disaster management and recovery. That can take the form of coastal protection, for example, whether it's infrastructure barriers or natural mechanisms like floodplains or mangroves. In urban environments, which we're very often focused on, that can take the form of sort of climate proofing is one of the sort of areas of adaptation. Architectural adaptations, for example, to reduce the urban heat island effects, high albedo surfacing, for example, to reflect more sunlight. There's even increasing effort to make infrastructures, buildings, homes more movable, of course, entire settlements potentially, and even some early work that's going on in terms of floating cities or floating infrastructures that can be used in different locations. So the broader movement perhaps around circular cities can even be considered an adaptation in that it seeks to increase self-sufficiency and to reduce dependency on far-flung supply chains. Now, there can be crossover between some of the things that I'm mentioning that fall into the category of adaptation, but also contribute to mitigation. That's fine. Again, it's not really about an either or, but creating more balance. And a final point I'd like to make, given some of my own work, is that adaptation also means moving people. And that means population, relocation, and resettlement. And of course, there's a broader global trend, perhaps, that we can see unfolding. Populations needing to move from coastal to inland, from lower lying to elevated, and so forth. And unfortunately, this is not the kind of topic that comes up very proactively at gatherings of sovereign nations. But it is essential for us to consider it as a matter of equity and a matter of survival. So the ultimate adaptation, you might say, is actually modifying our principles of sovereignty. So I won't dwell on that too much right now further, but suffice it to say that it is every bit as important as the other adaptations.
Okay, you've raised some very big questions there. I will come back to you, but let me just move to Preeti, if I may. Do you agree that financing is skewed towards mitigation and away from adaptation? And if that's true, how might that be changed?
David, I do agree. I agree with Parag on that. So for those of us who were at COP26 and hopefully will be at 27, we saw the emphasis, the capital coming to the meeting. Now the question is the capital flowing to the countries, to the local level? So in my estimates, the 100 billion, promised by the developed countries, about 40 billion perhaps is making its way towards some of these countries. Of that, we find that only 5% is towards adaptation. As Parag said, most of it is going towards mitigation, which would perhaps be clean energy, etc. And out of that 5%, only 20% is going towards the vulnerable countries, the lower income countries. And the reason I want to intervene here is because the UN Capital Development Fund, which I'm proud to lead, we cover the 46 least developed countries from the United Nations perspectives. So we're working in countries like Mali, Niger, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, some of the islands, and we are there on the ground. Let me take a moment to say that we do need adaptation to go into these countries, and we are leading a program called LOCAL, which stands for Local Climate Living Facility, and I'll be happy to go into some examples on the island and the Sahel regions. But yes, we do need this focus on adaptation first to protect the communities, as Parag said as well.
Something I want to dig into a little bit later in more detail, but just to raise the question now. I mean, adaptation in a sense is insurance, or I think of it as insurance anyway. And insurance is a cost. These projects are never going to generate a profit. Is that right, or am I missing something?
So you are correct in this way, that the way we are working, we take the donor capital and we put it through the local municipal systems of these countries. We call them performance-based resilience grants. So we do have performance that the member states, the countries have to meet to be able to access these grants. So in some ways, if we could figure out an outcomes-based payment mechanism, then the impact, the prevention of the vulnerability by having these mechanisms in place could be something that we could quantify in the capital markets. My ultimate vision for capital markets is that we're able to quantify a lot of aspects of human development, biodiversity preservation. So this outcome-based funding is something that we should look at if we can quantify that.
Okay. Letitia, tell us first of all about CFAN. And then I know that you think that there's a definitional question here, what we mean by mitigation, what we mean by adaptation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. So CFAN is a network of initiatives, regional and global, working in developing countries, in particular the most vulnerable countries. Some overlap with Preeti's scope, least developed countries and small island developing states. So we support those countries in unlocking climate finance. When we talk about the adaptation gap in terms of finance, it's not only the imbalance between adaptation and mitigation. Is also within the adaptation envelope. Those that need it the most have the greatest difficulties to access those finances. So we support those countries by supplementing capacity, hiring locally and training finance advisors that we deploy in the ministries and in the direct access entities in those regions. And secondly, by building capacity, lasting capacities in countries, making those countries less reliant on external expertise, and ensuring more country-drivenness and ownership in their adaptation and mitigation efforts. So that is what CFAN is doing currently. It has deployed advisors across the Pacific and now expanding to the Caribbean and soon to Sub-Saharan Africa. And as you mentioned,
yes,
David, this question of the definition. Again, looking at the IPCC report and the range of unavoidable impacts of climate change that are projected, does it still make sense to divide projects between adaptation and mitigation, or is it just a bureaucratic labeling at the end of the day? At CFAN and within RMI, we certainly believe that supporting developing countries, for example, in their transition towards renewable-based and decentralized energy system, is a measure of adaptation, making the whole society and the whole economy less vulnerable to external shock. And we also believe by broadening the scope of adaptation, being more flexible maybe in those definitions, we can bring the private sector on board and change the perception that adaptation needs to be public, led by public entities, needs to be uniquely grant-based, needs to be small in scale, and not very sophisticated in the financial structuring.
Okay, again, you've raised some questions there that I think we need to get into. Vivek, why don't we start? I mean, what role can private capital play in this? Some might see what we need is a big public transfer of public funds from the global north to the global south. and and sort of huge investments. Is there a role for private capital?
So I absolutely think there is a role for private capital, and just to sort of slightly disagree with the question you raised, the point you raised earlier with Preeti on whether these projects are viable or financially sustainable. I think some of them are, not all of them. So let's just take three buckets. So one is if you're building a piece of infrastructure, a road or airport or a port, you can actually make it resilient by sort of projecting what would be either, if it's a port, tidal surges or typhoons, or if it's a road, the intensity of flooding, and there is a lot of modeling going on, so you can actually make that piece of infrastructure resilient to climate shocks. So that's a case where private capital will flow. The costs will go up a little more, and you can try and offset those costs either by sort of getting longer dated capital, which is what a firm like ours would do. It should also result in lower insurance costs, and you may also need some amount of blended finance to make it viable. So that's one bucket. The other bucket would be if you're building, say, a seawall to protect coastal communities. Now, there you're not going to get any source of revenue. You can have taxes from that community, but that's probably the sort of thing where I think it's going to be more a public good, and that's where public capital comes in. And then somewhere in between, I'll give you another example, a sort of a seawall on the coast, but you've got a lot of tourism there. So you've got hotels there, you need to protect jobs. So that's, I would argue, a public good in many ways, but you can actually start charging those hotels some sort of a user fee to pay for that seawall that you're constructing, because it's really going to be integral to their survival. And then you look at something like a mangrove forest, where you may not get revenues, but hopefully as the carbon markets pick up, you could get carbon credits for it. So there are different buckets, and some of them I think private capital is going to play a role going forward.
Right. You always have to, in a sense, don't you, convince people of the hypothetical. The hypothetical being, if you don't do this, X will happen. If you don't protect this forest, it'll get chopped down. If you don't build this seawall, your hotel will be destroyed. There's an element of kind of the counterfactual in this. Is that right?
Well, I don't think so anymore, and I'll tell you why. If you open the FT every 10 days, you're going to have a story about flooding in Germany, or a forest fire somewhere, or a typhoon in the Philippines. So unfortunately, in some ways, what the misfortunes are actually convincing people it is a reality today. We are seeing typhoons in the Philippines with an intensity which we've never seen before, or flooding in Germany or other parts of the world. So yes, it does take some convincing, especially when you're talking about relatively sort of less sophisticated firms convincing them, or communities convincing them, is going to take a lot more time and effort. But I think that understanding is getting there very, very quickly today.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a question, Parag, that's coming from the audience. In a sense, it's a repetition of what we've just been talking about, but I think it's useful to put it to you as well. The question is, what will it take for the private sector to mobilize capital for adaptation, as it seems as though currently it is only the public sector considering and underwriting it?
It's a great question. I don't think that the question necessarily holds universally, right? Because clearly there are businesses that see it in their self-interest to invest in adaptation, to protect their assets, obviously, where they risk becoming stranded due to climate-related events. To take one example, so we see firms that try to conserve their water consumption, for example, and reduce their water consumption in order to be able to operate in the F&B industry and other sorts of cases. So there's that. And of course, in real estate, obviously, in terms of reducing insurance premiums. You actually said earlier that adaptation is a form of insurance. And Vivek said that adaptation measures should reduce your insurance costs. So in that sense, the private sector clearly can see the logic. And I think that this is a question that should be dealt with more sectorally rather than generalizing about the private sector. And then within each sector, you've got leaders and laggards, as you usually have. So the dynamic that we're seeing is not necessarily any different from when sort of challenges arise at the global level. You will have leaders and laggards, and you'll have different time scales depending on how exposed a sector is. Perhaps real estate, and property in general is a $200 trillion global industry. It happens to be a major laggard in this area, and yet clearly, given its stationary nature, it is very, very exposed. And so this is an area where I'm starting to see the wake up call starting to sink in. In other places, it's certainly in agriculture, I would say they're being more resilient because things change so rapidly, seasonally, as it were. And therefore, you're seeing companies and firms purchase, acquire, shift towards new geographies of production because they need to meet, obviously, certain demands and contracts. So again, different timescales for different sectors. But the private sector is already, I think, extremely central to this issue.
So if Coca-Cola, say, has new techniques to reduce its use of water, is that adaptation? I mean, this then becomes very broad definitionally.
Again, I think the rest of the panelists, I'm not going to put words in anyone's mouth, but I don't think that we are wedded to, again, sort of creating a dichotomy for the sake of it, even if I'm the one who started out with the definitional commentary. Obviously, if you are reducing your consumption of scarce or precious water resources, you are mitigating what are already, probably significant climate effects in the geography where you're operating, where you're consuming that water. And you are also, again, making adaptive investments in technologies that actually create new business models in a way, and you might consider that adaptation. So I'm perfectly happy for that to be considered an example of both.
Okay. Preeti, the term blended finance has come up quite a lot. First of all, can you tell us what blended finance is for anyone who doesn't know, and tell us how you think this is this is something we should be thinking about in this field?
Sure, David. So blended finance is bringing public and private capital together. So two aspects. One is called the first loss. So in a fund structure, so let's take a fund called Build that we have with Bamboo Capital, Impact Investors. It's a $250 million fund. 50 million of that is first loss, which is the donor capital that comes in to cover the 20% kind of a loss ratio if that were to happen, though we'll of course prevent that from happening. And then 200 million is the private capital that comes in. So the mix of this public and private capital allows for some guaranteeing, some protection, and then also reduces perhaps the overall returns. The donors don't ask for that return, so that can be then shared in a greater detail with the private investors. So there's a tranching level in that kind of fund. So it's bringing public-private capital together. Sometimes I think issuing a guarantee on a project is also, I would say, an example of blended fund because, for example, in Gambia, we put a guarantee on a solar plant that brought in like $15 million. So that's, again, a way of mixing public and private capital. So in our experience, reflecting what the other panelists said, yes, there are companies now working on adaptation, helping build some of that infrastructure, and those are companies into which we invest. So I would say there is investment of blended finance going into adaptation, really reflecting what Vivek was giving as examples as well. A lot of our work, I would say, at this stage through Locale is on the public side. So we are building, for example, rainwater harvesting, planting trees in Mali so that the roots of the trees create the water. But you see, all of these have externalities. If they're not done, then there will be, migration, starvation, etc. So one role I really want to challenge capital markets is somehow to put a tangible value on kind of that level of SDG achievement. So if you go from extreme poverty to a definition of basic standard of living, and some of these measures help achieve that basic standard of living, that should be an investable opportunity. And that it's a little bit related to tokenization. I hold a token in the kind of, let's say, forestation of Mali that makes it a livable community there. So that's some of the things that we're thinking about.
I mean, someone's mentioned offset projects. I mean, could that be done through an offset, for example?
No, absolutely. Yes, I totally believe that. And it's not a perfect solution, but offsets are, good for the moment. And we are working on many of such examples.
Not perfect, why?
Well, it's better that, the actual objective is done rather than people buying the offset to offset some of their activities, right? So yes, it's better that the actual investment is done into these projects. But till that is achieved, the concept of offsets, taking, for example, like Liberia has 44% forest cover. We feel Liberia has a natural asset and that they should benefit from offsets issued by that, the protection that we give to the world as a whole through Liberia, and that goes into the investment in human development there.
Through schemes like Red Plus, that kind of scheme.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
Letitia, I know you wanted to talk about blended finance too. Do you have anything to add? And I would also like to bring in Vivek on the same topic.
Yeah, and I'm very much aligned with my colleagues here. What I would like to make 2 points. First of all, blended finance. We also have now it's kind of the buzzword, and we try and apply this new approach to more and more projects. But let's not create yet another gap. Developing countries don't have the same capacity to develop those sophisticated projects and bring all the stakeholders around the table, public and private. So that's why building capacity at all levels, government, institutions, building the country systems, but also raising the awareness of the private sector. In many developing countries, the private sector might not be fully aware of climate projections and the risk, and what would be the value in investing in adaptation. So at all levels, civil society, of course, obviously, at all levels, building that capacity, that understanding and awareness is extremely important. And it seems easy, but actually it's quite difficult to find the funding for building that capacity. It's we say adaptation is kind of the neglected sibling. Well, in the climate convention, capacity building has been quite neglected as well, especially for the most vulnerable countries. The second aspect, I believe, to make this new approach to blended finance more understood is also to look at adaptation, not to avoid short-term issues, short-term damages, but really have a integrated whole of the society, whole of the economy approach. And you might have heard the terms of transformational adaptation, just like we talk about transformational mitigation. And it's really bringing all the actors together to define a common strategy, and this needs to be led by the public sector, and this will also create the enabling environment, the regulatory framework that will allow the private sector to make viable investment in such projects. So there's a whole infrastructure to build as a company. This, I believe, extremely positive. Let's not get stuck with the buzzword, but see what the work is needed behind happen.
Vivek, can I ask you about some examples of projects that the IFC has been involved in, where there's been innovative financing in, or blended finance, to use the buzzword, in the field of adaptation?
Yeah, so I think, we have a couple of examples in adaptation when it comes to the water sector. So last year, we did a loan to the water utility in Izmir to upgrade its treatment and supply infrastructure. And there was a sliver of blended finance, if I remember correctly, in that, because water is a public good. And the question is, how do you keep it affordable? So like Preeti said, there are two forms of blended finance. One is where the capital is a first loss. It's first loss, so that makes it more bankable in some ways. And it can then attract commercial capital and give it comfort in terms of improvement in credit rating, so on and so forth. The other form of blended finance is how do you get costs down? So it could just be, you can get blended finance at 20% is blended finance, which is either zero cost capital, but is returnable capital. And that's a big difference, but you just it drives the cost of debt down. So that's one thing. Then we did something, sustainability linked loan to Corsan, which is a water and sanitation services company owned by the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And there again, the focus was how do you reduce losses in water distribution and boost energy efficiency. There was no real blended finance because it was the math worked out, so that there we were quite lucky on that one. And then recently we're working on something in Nicaragua where it's early days, but how do you help farmers replant coffee plantations affected by climate-induced diseases? And in the bargain, what we're trying to do obviously is how do you get more resilient plant varieties in there? There, I suspect we will need quite a bit of blended finance to make it happen. So these are some examples where blended finance has helped adaptation. A lot to do in the water space. I think what we are really looking to do is scale up now is in the area of forestry, and where the returns will come from carbon credits. And there we will probably need blended finance to give the investors a level of comfort that if carbon credits were to fall below a certain price, you will get capital to try and make you whole there. Thanks.
Right. On forestry, some work that I actually did for the FT, there seems to be a problem with the way some of these projects are financed. I went to Gabon, for example, where roughly 90% of the country is covered in forest. But they haven't kind of destroyed their forest, unlike some other countries. Costa Rica, for example, where their forestry went right down. And then they were incentivized to a certain extent to build it back up again. What countries like Gabon are saying is, how do we get remunerated for not having destroyed our forest in the first place? This can kind of set up perverse incentives, can it not?
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the biggest challenges we face in the space of natural capital is there is no value to natural capital. Mm-hmm. And so that's really, I wouldn't even say it's $1 million question. It's probably $1 trillion question. Unless and until we can attribute value to something, it's going to be very hard to really make this whole thing work. So, you have a country which is rich in biodiversity, rich in forests. It doesn't get any, whereas if they had minerals in the ground, you can mine that and you can monetize that. Yeah. So because, price of copper and, you've got X million tons of copper you're going to mine, you know what that's going to be worth. But because there's no price to natural capital, I think what Gabon is saying is spot on. How do you incentivize these people to then not do sort of what they shouldn't be doing is cut the forests and replant them and then get a benefit? And yes, until and unless, I don't have a solution to that, honestly, David, but it's something which I would love for the world to focus on. And if y'all can help us get there, I think that would be fantastic. Yeah.
You called it the $1 trillion question. Maybe it's the $0 question, unfortunately, how to value natural capital. Parag, if I could turn to you, how, given that money is fungible, given that institutions are not always as well governed as we might want them to be, are there not potentially perverse incentives here? You can call anything an adaptation or a mitigation project. You can get funding, and then that funding can go on something else. Aren't we isn't the danger that that countries, that institutions, that individuals will try to game the system to get hold of capital that is supposedly, there to stop climate change? In fact, it's just free money.
Well, I might echo Preeti's sentiment in a couple of ways. One is, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I detected a little bit of, sort of cynicism about carbon markets and things that, are clearly derivatives and products that are not necessarily doing the tangible things that we want to see happen. And she rightly, in the second half of her answer, was focused on, again, what are the concrete things that we can see? We shouldn't really use the word concrete anymore, should we? When we talk about things like this, we should find tangible, meaningful, impactful, on the ground and real, is again, I think, more measurable when it comes to adaptation, right? How many people were relocated? What is the sort of, let's say, the new buildings that have been designed with a lower usage of, for example, concrete, right? Things like this, the diminished, again, energy consumption of a building. This is very, very measurable. Whereas when it comes to emissions, again, nothing against how existentially important it is to be reducing emissions and doing other things that are in the mitigation camp, not at all. But far, far easier to measure and more difficult to game, because they are indeed tangible. And this is perhaps one reason why I do favor us having this adaptation-focused conversation.
Right. I want to turn to Preeti in a second, but Parag, just one other question. You've talked about some kind of quite grandiose things, floating cities, moving populations, but you've also talked in pieces that I've read that you've written about projects that can actually be surprisingly, cheap. Painting roofs white, for example. Not all of this is expensive, is that right?
No, not at all. And that's just one example. So again, high albedo surfacing, so painting rooftops and these kinds of things are being done in major cities. Again, it derives from examples of places where it's already been underway for some time as just part of the local design culture, if you will. And now they're being adopted more widely. So that's certainly low cost. The cost of 3D printed housing or building housing in general through recycled materials has come down substantially. So I think that, by and large, remember, even before climate change is a major global theme, affordable housing was. So here we have an opportunity to be solving multiple problems at the same time by doing far more of our stock of housing through, far lower emissions generating recycled materials. And I applaud the companies that are putting a lot of capex, I might add, into developing the instruments, the tools, the platforms that actually allow us to do that. So not all of it has to be expensive at all.
Okay. Preeti, not all of this has to be done at national level. In fact, a lot of it is done at local level through municipalities. What are the advantages and challenges of that?
So we feel that people and problems are closer together at a municipality, right? So issues of water harvesting, some of that buffering against waves, etc. All of that can be tackled closer to the community. So therefore, we really believe in sovereign funding, but also sub-sovereign funding. And I feel there's not much of sub-sovereign funding around the world. So we've been really trying over the last 40 years to strengthen municipal level financing. And now we're at a stage where we are able to issue municipal bonds, municipal projects, and take that forward. Maybe I want to take a moment to just highlight 2 or 3 other instruments that might be interesting. So let's bring in Jamaica here. Charles Purnell, the Minister of Environment, he's saying, if you do not meet mitigation commitments, you make it harder for adaptation. If you don't put money towards adaptation, you will be dealing with loss and damage. So he says it's all connected. And this was all the debate of COP, right? So there's adaptation, we're putting that emphasis there, but also now insurance. A lot of our countries are saying that they really suffer from the impacts. So parametric insurance is another product that's getting linked into the debate. And we are happy to say in Fiji, we worked with the central bank to issue micro-insurance, parametric insurance called PCAP, so that the smallholders could have some degree of rebuilding ability once that's done. And then lastly, 2 other things, the infrastructure. There's a lot of emphasis on, climate resilient infrastructure. So we are creating bonds into the markets that will pull on municipal projects and then reinvest back in more climate friendly, climate resilient infrastructure. So as we go ahead, the world, the ESG commitments, all of that have to get linked with this emphasis on climate resilient infrastructure. And we have a project called SILRIF, which stands for Municipal Investment, again, trying to get all the municipalities to invest in infrastructure that's climate resilient. So just the last point would be the sustainability linked bonds. Sustainability linked bonds is what we need to bring to the market. They're coming on. There's already a 1 trillion in there. But that's where we could put in such measures. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Another good question from the audience. It says, how much impact do you think the fact that COP27 is in Africa will have on unlocking capital for adaptation? I don't know who wants to have a go at that, but I'm going to ask Letitia, first of all.
Africa is extremely clear that their number 1 priority is adaptation, and has been extremely vocal in the negotiation to adaptation is rebalance with mitigation, but is also accessible. So we can expect that adaptation finance, access to finance, what we call the quality of finance, is going to be top of the agenda in Sharm el-Sheikh. Also, remember that developed countries in Glasgow promised to double their allocation of adaptation finance. So we will be able already to sort of measure the trend, and not only if they have increased the provision, but make this funding more available. I think also being in Africa will put also shed some light on how we consider adaptation. And I think the Africa Group also mentioned indigenous knowledge is very often neglected, and pretty much talking about really initiating and generating those projects at the municipal level. In Africa, I believe we have seen so many examples of maladaptation because those projects were not sufficiently consulted and developing in close collaboration with the end beneficiaries in the various regions. So I do believe that at the COP, we will need to have those big global numbers finally trending upwards for adaptation, but we will also need to demonstrate successes on the ground, success story, and build on that knowledge to incentivize other stakeholders, actors, and countries to take more daring approach and decentralized approach to adaptation. Maybe just one more point. In the IPCC report, what also was very striking is that we're getting closer to limits of adaptation. For already many communities in the world, we talked about the small island developing states, but also in communities in Africa, especially smallholders, small farmers. Those communities are already on the edge. And therefore, there's an element of speed. We need to unlock the finance, and we need to do it fast. And that will also facilitate bringing on board the private sector. On that, developing a project for adaptation takes between 1 to 3 years. It's very difficult for the private sector to see an interest there. So we need to make it flow, and to make it flow at scale and at speed.
Vivek, we have about 3 minutes left. Again, turning to Africa and the fact that COP27 is going to be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Outside a few countries, South Africa being one of them, emissions are really not a problem in Africa. I mean, in fact, emissions are tiny. If anything, they need to emit more because, you still have vast populations that don't have access to, basics, electricity, for example. Given that, do you think this is finally the time when adaptation will come to the fore? When the case for adaptation can be best made, given that COP27 is going to be on the African continent?
So I certainly hope so, because it will be opportune, and we ourselves are trying to come and showcase a few projects in the area of adaptation. But what will be critical if you want private capital to flow in at scale is that you will need de-risking capital to come in. Without that, I think we will not be able to attract private capital at scale. And that's what we are really hoping that we can demonstrate in Sharm el-Sheikh later this year. I just want to go back to the point you raised in Munis. The two deals that I talked about, water in Izmir and in Brazil, were both municipalities. They were not private sector companies, and the one in Brazil was actually pretty a sustainability linked loan. So we're clearly seeing more of that there. So I think, in Africa, we are hoping that we can be able to attract donor money. And the good news is that private philanthropies are coming up a lot more in the area of climate now. So we are hoping that we can attract some capital in that space now.
Thank you so much to everybody. I think that's been a really engaging and interesting panel. We've covered finance. We've covered areas of adaptation. We've covered the need to really kind of refocus the debate And I think that all your interventions have been extremely valuable. So thank you so much. Our next panel will explore whether vertical farms are a solution to loss of agricultural biodiversity. It will be moderated by my colleague, Emiko Terrazono, the commodities correspondent. Thank you to all.